Hello and welcome to all the men and women of the West. I'm Joe, and today I've got a video that honestly I was initially pretty keen to make, but now kind of, having had time to stop and think about it, I'm rather meh at this point, weirdly. It's a matter that, let's just jump in. Black Aragorn. The race changing thing has been something that's become pretty common in the past 10 years or so. Sometimes, let's be honest, it does work. I mean, in Shawshank Redemption, they blackwashed Red from a ginger Irishman into Morgan Freeman. And we can all say that we don't have a complaint about this change, as Morgan Freeman knocked it out of the ballpark. So, this sort of change can be done well. Let's just be honest. In certain circumstances and with certain characters. The thing about Red as a character is that race was not really important. That said, the thing about Aragorn and Éowyn and Theoden is that they are derived from Tolkien's English mythology, a mythology dedicated to England and to his wife and children. So, in that regard, it's not something that really fits, to be honest. Now, before you hit the unsub button or scream at me, just hear me out. I want to actually have a nuanced analysis here. I don't agree with the change. I'm just going to come out of the gate. But that's because I like Aragorn. And in the novel, he's described as pale. As to Theoden and Éowyn, they're people who are supposed to be ancestors to rather more Anglo-Nordic people. They are the inspiration. They are inspired by Northern courage. That is to say, the courage that all those that were once part of the Norse or Northern Empire of Scandinavia, which included England, parts of Ireland, and all of Scandinavia, and I think parts of Russia, are all kind of supposed to be in possession of this great virtue of Northern courage. And I think that in that regard, the Wizards of the Coast are blatantly just baiting people. They're trying to get you angry. So the best solution to this, not to get angry. Why bother getting angry? Because if you get angry, you've simply, to their minds, proven them right. And it's rather, at the end of the day, we shouldn't let them bait us. We should hold to what we think, those of us who don't agree with the change, and just ignore it. We still have the books. I mean, just buy the physical paperback, hardcovers, and whatnot, and even what graphic novels there are, or the movies if you love them, and cling to them. I don't think that there's a necessity for an explosion of emotion here. As calmness and serenity and even pleasantness are what most people probably want to aspire to. And Aragorn, let us be honest, is gray-eyed, dark-haired, and pale. Éowyn and Theoden are likely supposed to be blonde and are likewise pale. So, in that regard, Magic the Gathering has certainly dropped the ball. And they did so quite purposefully. We all know it. But now I'm going to move to analyzing the art. And the art does actually look pretty good, or at least the Aragorn one does. I actually really like the visual image that I see. And I think that in that regard, they obviously hired an artist of some talent. Let's just be honest. Just because one does not like the blackwashing of Aragorn, Eowyn, and Theoden doesn't mean that one can't appreciate talent where it can be shown and seen. That aside, I think that what is also very notable is that the Wizards of the Coast have, now I don't know if they actually have cards or art for this quite yet, but they have, let us be honest, ignored African mythology and fantasy. Now, I'm not terribly familiar with fantasy fiction from Africa. I've heard of one called Rage of the Dragons, which I hear is really good, and I want to read it at some point. I might read it for a series of Storyfire book club videos after I finish, of course, my weekly Narnia and the Prydain series, and of course Conan Beyond the Black River book clubs, because those are the immediate ones. And I'll do it while I'm also reading Dragons of Winter Night. But that aside, there is also the mythology of Prester John. Prester John was a Christian figure, a Christian mythological figure from the medieval period with his own brand of literature that surrounded him. Essentially, he was a Arthurianic figure. Aragorn, as everyone knows, is derived from King Arthur. He's supposed to be basically a King Arthur type. King Arthur himself, in terms of literature, is semi-derived from Charlemagne. But there is a third kingly figure who features in medieval literature as a very, very great monarch who stands above all other monarchs, Prester John. And the thing about Prester John is that as he's African, he should perhaps more than likely be portrayed in art, and I have seen good art of him, which you can see in this video, he should be presented as an African monarch, someone with very dark skin. So if one was to repurpose this Aragorn card as Prester John, I'd say, wow, is this one of the coolest looking things to come out in recent media. So maybe it's not up to us to fly into a rage here, as one shouldn't cry and moan here about supposedly lost culture, as we still have the books and movies and whatnot, but rather we should perhaps take a moment and think about becoming the culture to an extent. And that leads me to one statement which some may consider controversial, but I don't consider it at all controversial. I have heard the phrase Iron Age of culture, and that this should be what a lot of people aspire to. And while I respect those who want to have good storytelling and want to carry on the traditions of Western literature and canon, so to speak, especially in rather more pulp style, because pulp fiction is making a comeback, which kudos to those wanting it back. It was a great time in terms of literature. I just think that fantasy shouldn't aspire to an Iron Age. It is my view, I'm going to be honest, that fantasy fiction has seen a decline in the past 30 years. And that this is not a recent trend. And what is more is that rather than aspire after an Iron Age, maybe what we need to do is aspire after a Golden Age. Let's go back to Tolkien and Howard. Writers shouldn't try to aim for being their lesser, but rather aim for them, for what Tolkien and Howard were trying to do. Create mythology. So, on that note, and on the fact that I am a firm believer in a can-do attitude now because of a recent one-week trip, which has been the greatest week of my life. And I have a new attitude on things and a new view. I think that rather than simply complain or something, as that doesn't solve any problems, and frankly, I don't think there's any reason to sit about and do nothing and complain. Not that I'm claiming anyone is doing that. I am just simply saying I don't like the idea of doing so. So I will now be writing a African fantasy novel. And the reason I'm doing that is that I'm going to put my mouth where my money is. I'm going to try to create something more African based, probably based on Swahili culture and whatnot, and set in a fantasy version of Kenya, as I really like Kenya. And I'm not going to say don't buy these cards or something, because you'll do what you want. Buy what you want, love what you love, and do so unrepentantly. I will say, though, that while I do not like Magic the Gathering by nature, I just don't understand the card game. And while I disagree with the decision Wizards of the Coast made, it is their choice. They got the licensing. They paid for it. That's that. And that not everything needs to be... All we need is to maybe change our attitude on things. And you, like I said, you don't have to buy if you don't want to. But if you want to, do what you want. It is your money. It is your life. And I hope everyone liked this slightly calmer video than what I imagine most others are doing. And I hope that everyone won't mind too much if I do the occasional community tab update on my African novel, because I am thinking I should maybe turn that into a weekly thing, or maybe I'll just make the weekly updates for free over on Patreon, because why not? And to those who feel rather more angry about things, that's fine. It's good to care deeply about things, but remember, you should aspire to the Golden Age. Remember thy ancestors. Remember all that came before. Treasure that, preserve that, and aspire after that, is what I will say. And if this video has pleased any of you who have stayed throughout this entire video, I do hope you'll consider smashing that like and that subscribe button as though you were Melkor tearing at it with all of his wrath.